CEEW's Energy Horizons 2019, and I have with me Rana Adib, the Executive Secretary of REN21. And this is the part of the Power to Think conversations, and what we'll be discussing today is what more needs to be done to create robust, clean energy markets around the world. So Rana, this is stuff that you spend a lot of your time thinking about, and with the new Global Status Report just out, how far have we come in the last 10 years, given that the GSR has been mapping year-on-year activity?
Thank you very much, Kanika. So yes, indeed, I think we have come quite far when we are looking in particular into the renewable energy power sector, because here we do see that renewable energy power is here to stay and mainstream. It's cost competitive in almost every country. We have the case of Brazil, where technology neutral auctions lead to the fact that the bidding solar PV and wind projects were winning because they are least cost. So this is something which is very encouraging. When we are looking, however, at the whole energy situation, the situation is much more challenging because contrary to the power sector, where we have 26% of the electricity share which is covered by renewables, when we're looking into the heating sector, it's only about 10%, and in the transport sector only 3.3%. And this is very critical because heating, cooling and transport represent 83% of the total foreign energy demand. So here we need much more policy ambition and frameworks, because we do see that there are 135 countries which have policies on renewable power, only 70 on heating and cooling, 70 on transport and 20 on heating and cooling. So I guess this is really the big challenge. One of the big challenges today is moving from an electricity transition to an energy transition. And
yeah, I think actually in the Indian context as well, we see a very similar example. So we've seen rapid strides in renewables, especially solar and wind, contributing to the electricity sector. And surprisingly, despite there being not a very large manufacturing base for solar PV in India, we're still seeing some of the lowest solar PV prices and a very well-functioning, globally integrated value chain as well. But that doesn't necessarily translate for other sectors. Although what is really heartening and exciting is a week and a half ago was the budget announcement, and electric vehicles actually received a lot of attention. And it was very interesting because the way that the budget addressed the electric mobility transition was from a behavioral perspective, where the only fiscal incentive that was given was for consumers who buy electric cars. And I think that that's really interesting because for the largest part, we've seen a lot of the transition discussion in India, but also around the world, more on the supply side. But this was in some ways the first demand driver, and in some ways, the announcement was for consumers to really take notice and say, okay, actually I want this, and demand for it so that the industry can catch up, as opposed to the other way around. So that was interesting. But do you think that in the heating sector, it's more complicated because there aren't enough business models or market opportunities? Why is it?
I would like to compliment just on the transport sector before coming to the heating sector, because indeed I think the whole e-mobility discussion is a real opportunity also globally. We do see this. However, it's important to say that these markets today are still very much concentrated in 2 countries, 20 cities, and only represent something like 2.5% of the new car sales.
Yeah.
And another aspect here too, and I think this is something which really pushes much more for integrated approaches, is only approximately a quarter of the electricity used in the e-vehicles is renewable. So it is fundamental to link basically the energy end users, and I think it's perfect to come from this demand side to planning capacities, renewable energy capacities, whether these are electric capacities or also thermal capacities. Now, on the heating and cooling part, very clearly, one aspect is that there is not a very good understanding of what the heat markets are. Because they are very local markets. It's not a global or a national industry very often. So on Renton One side, we are really trying to have a better understanding of what the situation is in the heat markets, so that this can then also feed into scenarios and all planning tools, because I think there is a joint agreement of all major players working on renewable energy data that we need to improve heat data. That's one aspect. The other one, and we're working for the moment on the Renewables in Cities Global Status Report, because we do see that in the heat sector, these might actually be transitions which are driven very much by subnational governments. 50% of the heat demand globally is in buildings, and these are, especially when we're thinking about the increasing urbanization also, I think the assessment is 80% of the population will be living in cities.
Yeah.
So city governments have a key role to...
Sure. Actually, you said something earlier which I found really interesting, because it strikes a chord with us. So one of the biggest pillars of the work that we do at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water is data. Right? And I know that that's a shared value that we have with REN 21 as well. But to what extent do you think that data will be the engine that powers the transition? And I mean, we have the data from policies and from, fiscal benefits, etc. But what about industry data, investment data, and of course, like you said, heat loads and especially in with warming climate and with growing incomes in developing countries, and including in India, for instance, what we're seeing as a whole new peak load, which is from air conditioning, yes. Which is a late night peak load that's emerging. So how important will data be in driving the transition?
So I would not say that data is the only driver for the transition, but data is fundamental to drive the transition and inform actually the decision-making processes, which then frame the transition. So policy and regulative framework, investments are decisions which need to be informed. And basically, if you're planning these on a bad data situation, and today we're still in a situation that these decisions are not driven in a only intuitive way, but also fact-based, it is important to have a much better and broader understanding of what is ongoing. And as an example, when Renton One started tracking basically renewable energy in 2005, renewable energy was not visible in energy statistics. Even though they were a reality, and we knew this from project developers, etc. Then we moved ahead and we started tracking very much the role of renewable energy in energy access, and today it is something which is being consolidated by industry associations, because it is a reality. And this obviously is something which is taken into account, and I think we had the discussion before where it is very clear that also governmental players say we need to stop thinking about renewable energy only in rural electrification and a large scale, but it is a more global approach. That's
right.
one thing. But also in attracting, as you rightly said, investments which are fundamental to drive the transition.
Actually, that in some ways, what you were saying when you started tracking renewable energy data, because now at the Centre for Energy Finance, when we're thinking about investments in renewables as an infrastructure class, it's the same. It's such a sliver. They're in sort of low 1 to 3 percentage points, if not lower, even as a part of the power sector exposure. But also, it is the very principle of evidence-based decision-making that's driving us to monitor this on a day-to-day basis. Because we realize that policy is often the signal that is needed, but at the end of the day, it's finance that's the fuel that will engine the growth of the economy. So it's actually really interesting for us as well to be monitoring this, and I think that there's a lot of complementarity between the work that you're doing and the work that we're doing, especially to think about what business models, how do you adapt them to different countries, what works in country A will not work in country B. And so that I think is a very interesting space to be in now. So I think that the energy transition is definitely happening. It's the way that we do our work, how efficient we are at our work, that will determine the pace of the transition and how efficient it is.
Yes, I mean, I would agree, and so we're working together since a while already, and I do see major opportunities to continue working together, and also in this new space, which is basically finance, which is something which had less attention from Renewable side in the past, but where we are also having discussions today, because we also see that the finance world, I mean, these are players which also allow to bridge basically the renewable energy sector to the broader economic space. And that's something which is fundamental in terms of making the renewable energy fuel the conventional fuel of tomorrow. We cannot stay in the silos. So I think there are great opportunities here. What I also feel is, yes, evidence-based decisions are fundamental. What is also important, and we see this in many countries, there is still a problem of public acceptance. There is still a problem of myth being out there. And having the facts also allows to tell a better story, which is more credible. And that's something which is, I think, very important. And for instance, on the finance and investment side, and we had these discussions, I'm an industrial engineer, so this is definitely not my way of thinking. But here there are very important mechanism, I think, which also need to be communicated to outside decision makers who do not have the same way of thinking, but are fundamental and need this understanding to be able to really bridge basically the different sectors and decision makers.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, especially in a country like India, but also other emerging economies where there's so many competitive uses of public money. The narrative needs to be clear so that people know what is the value that's coming. Especially in countries where there's growing electricity demand, a lot of renewable energy is going to create new jobs. It's going to create new livelihoods. But also, there's local environmental benefits in the form of sort of lower air pollution and using renewable energy applications, say for farming and for water pumping, things like that. So I actually think that the communities need to be engaged more in the energy transition, and that way there's really not going to, I think it's also going to make our political decision makers more accountable, so that they know that they can't have changing stances on renewable energy, and that the people want it, and if that demand is there, they can't take it back.
Yeah, and to be honest, I also think it's we're also moving to a moment where we are moving away from just the supply way and seeing energy or renewable energy as an approach where it is more technology driven, and we're talking about the infrastructures and the value chains, but which are very narrow in our understanding, to something where we see energy is being used everywhere and is a driver for economic activities in so many sectors which do not think energy, but they consume it. And I think this is really also where we need to find like cross-cutting players and languages which apply to all sectors, and where we have, when we're talking about an energy transition and developing renewable energy, it should not only be the renewable energy ministry or the energy ministry sitting around the table, but the finance ministries. And when we're talking about labor, for instance, clearly social and work regulations and policies are fundamental in driving it. So really breaking out of our silos will be key.
Actually that is in fact the next masterclass at Energy Horizons today is about how do you bridge the communication gap between the energy community that talks in hertz and joules and megawatts, and the finance community that talks in dollars. So I think we should make our way to that. So thank you very much, Rana. This was great, and thank you for joining us in this Power to Think chat.